Wow, this is a huge room. Thank you for all coming. I didn't expect there to be so many people. I gave this talk a little while ago, and it was meant for a 45-minute slot, and I'm going to do it in 20. So I'm going to talk really, really fast, and hopefully it keeps you on your seat. So let's get into it. I'm Erik. I'm a principal designer, not a senior designer, John. A little bit of difference, but not too much. I make a lot of stuff at Uber. I've had a hand in almost all the visualizations you've seen on the screen so far. For the last couple of years, I've been focusing on our data group and also in our advanced technologies group with self-driving. I'm going to talk to you about designing with data at Uber and how this sort of inspires product features. And before I get into the details of it, I want to set some context with just how big the data is at Uber. We just hit our 5th billionth ride last year, and I'm sure it's a lot higher now. We do 15 million rides every single day in 65 countries and 600 cities. We build product in a whole variety of super complex locations all around the world, and understanding people, their motivations, their patterns, their behaviors is essential for us to dial in user experience. And at this scale, you just simply can't do it without data backing a lot of your decisions. We go all around the world to do research interviews. And these are photos that are taken from when we get to meet these nice folks. And in these interviews, we learn a whole bunch of things about their families, about their motivations, about their passions, about what puts them on the Uber platform as a rider or a driver, and really the intrinsic motivations they have to use our products. Problem with this is I'm not a researcher, and I don't go globetrotting into people's homes to understand these insights firsthand. I do strive, though, to understand all the same things. I want to understand what drives people to our products. I want to understand what's working for them, what's not. But I just don't do it through surveys and in-home interviews. I do it through data. So sometimes I play the role of an ethnographer. Sometimes I play the role of a technologist or a designer, but I do it using data as my medium. So while these interviews we can learn a ton from in terms of how people are using our products and asking them to recall certain aspects that they liked or disliked, it's really hard to do this at scale. And you can't simply send the 400 designers that we have all around the world to do all these in-person interviews. So that's when we start turning to data. So those kind of interviews are great, but they can't tell us things like a person's driving style. If you ask someone, what's your driving style like, they might say they're a really safe driver, but in reality, they might be in the top 10 of hard breakers or fast accelerators. And so data can tell us this. If you ask them how they drive and where they drive, they might not be able to recall exactly that, or how their driving changes with seasonality. And so through data, we can have a pretty unbiased way of looking at that. But if we take a step back, it's not just the individual, it's also at sort of a larger geographic level. So we can start to understand how entire populations move across geographic areas. And we can use our data and our tools to understand this. If you go even farther back, you can start to understand how entire countries wake up and go to sleep and party. And it's fascinating. And I think these are really beautiful explorations of how data starts working for us to understand our users. The big takeaway, though, is data is a super powerful tool in our design tool belt, and we use it to develop our products. So for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to talk about data in 3 different ways. One being using data to understand behavior. Second one is we have products that are out in the world and people that are using them, and we like to validate whether or not those things are working. And so we use data to sort of understand the impact. Then the last one's a little bit of the craft of how do you tell the stories with data? How do you make a compelling argument with data? And so there's a little bit of design at the end there. So let's start with behavior. I have participated in some of these research interviews, and what I've always found is, you're asking folks to recall things that they like, things they don't like, and I'm pretty sure that the mind is fairly unreliable at recalling things accurately. We tend to overemphasize things that are good. We tend to minimize things that are bad. Some of that's cultural, and some of that is just human psychology, it's coping mechanism, it's how we've evolved over years and years and years. And so it's nobody's fault. We just can't get accurate data from surveys and interviews. So we can, use a drop-off as a fairly contrived example, but I'll give you this simple example as a way to explain what I mean. People want to go here. The data says people actually end up here. And so people are getting dropped off or getting out of the car, not where they expected to go. And these people were probably really pissed. But if you asked anybody, how was your trip? I don't know, 3 months goes by, no one's going to remember. They're going to say, oh, it's fine, it's great. That's not fine. It's not fine to be dropped off 5 blocks away from your location. So, it's our job to understand what is the variance? Why are people getting out away from where we're expecting them to be? Why are they walking? What was the conditions at that moment? And these are the types of things that lead to better product features, like walking or hotspots, or snapping to hotspots on maps and tagging exits in our mapping technology, and things like that help drive better user experience. But it goes all the way up and down the chain. So if we see that data, we can go talk to the maps team, say, we missed fidelity in our product, and then it's ultimately a design solution that's driving the conversation between these different groups. And so, this is a kind of classic example of where data really helped us drive a solution for what we now have as Pool. But before Pool, when drivers were going to people's doorsteps, it was generally inefficient. And so having folks walk to a common point not only worked better for our business, but also for our users. So just a simple example of data sort of informing product. I'm going to jump over to airports. Airports are these super dense, complex, like micro cities within themselves. Some of the biggest frustrations happen in airports. And it's super interesting when you can watch this little worm thing going on here, where this is a rider, so maybe it happened to you, getting requesting a driver, he's missing him, going around 5 or 15 minutes later, they get picked up and then they go on their way. And that's a super nuanced thing, and understanding exactly what happens in a very unbiased way is ultimately how we need to solve this problem. So we can see this for the first time, combining these disparate data sources, and ultimately that's going to help us do a better job in suggesting exactly where you need to be and when you need to be there, and also extending the experience beyond the screen into the physical world and developing better partnerships with our airports. And so data is really at the crux of how we come up with these solutions. And it certainly helps us understand where the pain points are with much better fidelity. So the last two examples were how we use data to make our products better. And John kind of mentioned this earlier. We also are very interested at Uber in making cities better. And we have a tool that, well, actually, before I get into the tool, I'm going to talk about London. This is an example. This example actually led to the tool that we created. London introduced the night tube. And the intention of the night tube was to help folks traveling at night through public transportation out into the outer boroughs. What this visualization is showing is all these little bursts coming out of these circles. These are train stops in the outer boroughs, and these are trips going the few extra miles back to their homes. And what we saw was an overall decline in Uber trips in the city center in late hours. And what that means is the London night tube is working. And that's something that I think London would like to know. And so we took that notion and baked it into a tool called Uber Movement. And this idea that if we can give data back to cities, they can understand their cities much better. So we have sort of this rolling window of 2 billion data points that cities can use to understand what travel times look like, what traffic patterns look like. This one's most particularly interesting. I don't know if it's released yet, but hopefully coming soon. But the idea that we have hundreds of thousands of drivers out on the road every day, and between accelerometer and telematics data, we know where potholes are, almost in a snapshot instantly at any moment of the day. For a city to understand where all of its bad road conditions are in the past would have taken months of data collection and parsing and stuff like that. So I think this is going to be very powerful. I expect this platform to sort of blossom in the future, but it's really sort of early days right now. So in summary, design gives us a pretty unbiased way. The mind is unreliable of looking at behavior. Data helps us ask much better questions based on reality earlier on, and it really extends the field of product field research, in my opinion. So let's jump over to people. We're going to go on a trip around the world to Saudi Arabia. So here in Saudi, we have Saad, and 3 or 4 years ago, there was no Uber in Saudi, and women are legally barred from driving there. And so the only solution was to get private transport, which had wait times around 50 minutes. And in addition to that, the drivers were not licensed in these private transportation models. So it was generally unsafe for women to travel alone in these private cars. So I'm happy to report, a couple years later, 4 years later, 80% of the trips we take in Riyadh is by women. We have an average wait time of 4 minutes. Most importantly, all background checks happen on drivers, and so everyone's 100% licensed. And when we look at that impact on a map, and we look at how 80% trips look color-coded by gender, it's really striking to see sort of the intensity difference there. Similarly, in Indonesia, this is Sadiq, and he recently brought his family over the poverty level through Uber. And what that means in his country is he can afford a refrigerator to keep food cool, milk cold, and air conditioner to keep his house a little bit colder, which might not seem like a big deal for us, but it shows in our data that, in our research, that those two conditions are multipliers for kids doing well in school. And it's actually a gateway into a more successful academic environment. And so he can't read. That's kind of interesting side note about Sadiq here is he can't read. So every time he uses our app and we change it, he has to go back to the Greenlight Hub and learn it again and memorize it. There's also some interesting things here with a growing middle class in Jakarta, the lower literacy levels, and then also because of the given road conditions, most of our trips are taken on bike. And so we want to know how Moto is working in this location. So let's look at that. And this is one of my favorite vises here because we have our products color coded. The pink ones are the Moto. So here in the morning, you'll see this huge swell of all the Moto drivers going into the city, taking people to work or bringing people back. And then you'll see a kind of a surge of orange, and the orange trips are actually going to airports. And so you can see they're going from the city center and back. And so I think not only does this show like the products are working, but it also starts to hint at who's living where and describes the geographic land a little bit more. And then lastly, we have this interesting age demographic here. This is the 65 and older age demographic. You know, this is like my parents fall into this group. I'm sure a lot of yours do too. This is the fastest growing population in the United States. In the next 20 years, is going to account for 20% of all people in the United States. And so what we see from a data perspective is a ton of opportunity for a lot of folks. They're missing their medical visits. 3.5 million people are missing their medical appointments because they just don't have access to mobility. That's a ton of people. And for them, folks that may have had their license taken away, Uber's freedom again. And it's been described to folks as being a similar feeling that they had when they had their first car. They can go wherever they need to go. And so we have this product called Uber Central. And Uber Central allows businesses like nursing homes to book Ubers on behalf of their patients. And so what does that look like? How do we measure impact with that? And what I think was kind of interesting here is this is one location. This is one nursing home. And we look at, you know, these rings of 5 kilometers being maybe an average distance a nursing home would travel with its patients or with its residents, you know, without Uber. And now we see where people are actually taking Uber, and it's all over the place. And I think that's really awesome. So that's some people and how we sort of look at impact in cities of how our products are working. Last thing I'm going to talk about is narratives and, you know, some of the craft of how we make these things. So here's data. I think everyone in the room knows what this is. If I would have came to this talk and showed you a bunch of tables, Mika would have probably never invited me back. So, you know, we all know what data looks like, and we know that after it gets to a certain size, a table is just not the best way to look at it. It can sometimes be the best way to look at it, and oftentimes the worst way to look at data. And so when you're at scale, you inevitably have to move into sort of a 2D visualization of the data. And so here we're taking advantage of the geographic nature of this data, we're putting it on a map. So now we can start to make a little bit more sense of it here. But even getting it to this point takes a little bit of finesse. So let's back up. We look at what computers typically do when you jam 3 million data points into a program like QGIS. You get something like this. And there's no signal here, just a bunch of noise. So what do? We change the color, we change the radius. We might end up with something like this. It's good, but very muddy. So then we turn down the opacity, and now it starts to look like this, but it's a little undersaturated. And then we say, blending mode. So we go blending mode, and then half the data is gone. And we think, this looks pretty good. But the whole point is to evaluate this large scale data in an accurate way. And we're removing half of it off the screen. So you can't really make an accurate call on what's happening here when half the data is not even on the screen. So what we can do, I guess the point of this, and I'll talk about how we do it in a second, is we want to understand the distribution. We want to understand the relationship of all the data and not remove it from the page, but just understand the distribution a little bit better. So there's this technique, I don't know if there's a name for it or not, but we essentially bin very small areas of the screen, like at the pixel level, see how many data points are layering up within those bins, and then assign color to each one of them. And that gives us this really epic sort of nice organic distribution of color, and we didn't have to remove anything off the screen. So now very quickly we can see where the trips are happening. Well, this is probably validating what we already know. All the trips happen in Manhattan, and then they trickle out outwards. But then, on this journey of creating this narrative, we start playing with color. And maybe blue looks good. Some of this is just trial and error before we arrive at the right thing. One of my favorite things to do when we have this much data is just looking up really close at it, because now you can start to see almost every individual data point. And I don't know, for me, I just can't help but see the humanity in the data. These are actual people now, and you can almost see them. And so, now we have a data, we have the distribution right, but we want to sort of tell a story around it, and we need to bring it to life. And at this moment, it's important to understand, like, who's your audience? Who's going to look at this data viz, and what story are you trying to tell? If you're going to explain, traffic fatalities, you're not going to use pink and blue and all these happy colors. If you're making a case for something more serious, then you're going to use a serious color palette. You're going to compose it in a way that's going to resonate with your audience. You want to evoke the emotion through color and composition with your audience. So that's how we start to do that. Here's an idea. Here's a notion of how one might come together. If we color code our products from blue to yellow with X and black and pull and eats, one thing that I found kind of interesting is like a happy accident here is we have this very natural gradient going from blue to orange. I don't know how well you can see it on this screen, but it's fairly reflective of Manhattan to Brooklyn. And we have our higher cost product options and our lower cost product options. And I think that's also reflective of the socioeconomic divide of this geographic area. And what I think is really awesome about this is one half a day snapshot of Uber trips happening in Manhattan. You could take US census data that takes 7 years to collect, and I bet you would get a pretty similar kind of result if you plotted that. And so I think, I don't know what to say about that, but it's pretty cool. So moving along our 2D, 3D, 4D, 5D spectrum here, we're going to talk about adding dimension as a third dimension to sort of telling that story. So we have volumetric data, and we might start out with points plotted in Rio. We might bin them into hexes to start to understand a little bit of signal here. And then we pull it out in 3D, change the color palette, and it starts to look really cool. But I don't think we're taking advantage of the height here necessarily. So we are validating probably what we already know, which is all the trips are happening in the city center. But it looks sweet. We can change the color to take advantage of that height. And so now if we want to understand at a higher resolution, where are the problems happening at sort of almost like a city block level, we could correlate height with price or wait times or general time it took to get picked up. And all these things help us dial in exactly where the pain points are and how they change over time. These concepts are not necessarily, I showed a lot of Uber data and a lot of map data, but color, composition, presenting, connecting with your audience, these are not specific to Uber. I've been employing these techniques in a whole host of different ways for years and years and years. And I think there's a lot of good tools here to help tell that story. Data is sort of the tool to help tell that story. So the last dimension is time. And, for me, when you add that dimension of time and you're really telling a story through motion, that's when, I think the most compelling data stories come into play. Here, this is Uber's growth into cities. Another one here is sort of traffic during rush hour in Manhattan. Again, I guess I really liked Manhattan when I was making all these things, but fairly gratuitous cinematic camera movements, but I think it looks sweet. So, you're going to pick and choose your treatment for your audience and for what it's for. This wouldn't be appropriate maybe in an academic setting, but certainly would be compelling in maybe an editorial piece. So, yeah, so those are a couple examples. Here's another one, not Uber, but again, taking the literal sense of data, of people being represented by data, plotting them on map, and using these camera movements to really connect the ideas of like where data is and how it connects to the overall scale of things. So this was an interactive article that was describing the impact of healthcare throughout the United States. And so you can see some interesting concepts there. Here's another example, data in ATG. This isn't what it looks like anymore, but at least a little while ago, we were using our LiDAR visualization to help the rider in the back seat understand the intent of the car a little bit better. And we're using color to indicate the height on the LiDAR visualization, and orange to indicate objects of interest. And that's very raw LiDAR data. You couldn't even imagine like how we could finesse this more and more, but that was one way we used color and data in ATG. And then there's 5D data. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know what 5D data is. It could be AR, VR. I imagine a day where I'm like swimming through data with a headset on. My wife would think I'm nuts, but I think there's something here. I can't wait to see what it is. I'm sure someone in this room will come up with amazing stuff someday. And as a plug, John already kind of did this. I thought it was going to be special. All the viz that you saw in my deck, I made with Kepler. Kepler was a tool that the visualization team recently released. It's open source. It's super fast. It's like the tool I wish I had forever. And that's why I'm super proud that it's out there in the world now. So use Kepler. It's great. And that's it. Thank you.
Public apology for getting your title wrong. That's what happens when you don't have speaker notes. Thanks, man. That was amazing. All right, next up, Elijah.